idea that China is going to end up like a Western-style society is a nonsense. China will remain China. China had a very strong view of itself as a very advanced civilization that was maybe the most advanced civilization in the world. I mean, of course, they didn't know the world then, but for periods this was certainly the case. But the Chinese response to this was not to try and civilize other peoples, other countries, other territories. On the contrary, the Chinese approach to this was essentially to remain within China. There's no real history of, there are certain 2 or 3 examples, but there's no real history apart from imperial expansion as the Chinese Empire grew in the early period. There's no real examples of China invading other countries. And even when they did invade, for example, Vietnam in the early part of the 15th century, it didn't stay there, it came out again straight away. So that was a form of punishment, if you like, rather than an invasion. So there was no tradition in China of developing colonies abroad, which it controlled, it ran, which were part of the Chinese empire, if you like. Whereas in the West, or in Europe we're talking about essentially here, Europe was exactly the opposite. What happened with Europe was that after the great voyages of discovery and so on, then very rapidly after this came colonization. Why? What was the mentality? The mentality was, we will civilize the uncivilized. We will seek to control these countries. We will govern these countries in our own image. They will use our language. They will learn our history. They will learn our education in the school, do our education in the schools and so on. That was essentially the European approach. So this was a very different kind of attitude. And the consequence is that, sure, China had the tributary system, which was its own system of international relations in this region, but it wasn't a colonizing exercise. On the contrary, by and large, China didn't seek to intervene or control the tribute states. That was not what China was trying to do. What China wanted was stability and order, and it wanted to set an example, and it was keen that other countries might follow it, but it had no expectation of them to follow it. I think the world will find this very difficult to believe, because what model of global power are they accustomed to? Basically, all the top of the global powers, especially America and Britain before that, have been Western powers, and they have brought to the way they saw global leadership, global dominance, they have brought their own values and their own history. And China comes from something very different. The problem is that most people in the world, of course, don't really know much about China. China has been a closed book for so long during the period of the century of humiliation and so on. So there's a lot of ignorance about China. But, they will learn that China is very different. The book, my book, When China Rules the World, was published in the West, which started in 2009. It was definitely against the conventional wisdom. It was definitely against the assumptions about China. I mean, at that stage, the assumptions about China were there was going to be an economic crisis at some point. The economic growth rate could not possibly be sustained. The political system was also did not enjoy legitimacy, and also at some point would implode or explode or whatever have you. In other words, China was living on some kind of borrowed time. Now, my argument in the book, of course, was that, on the contrary, Chinese economic growth would be sustained, that the forces that were underpinning it were very deep historical forces which were ongoing and would last for a considerable amount of time, that the political system, far from being fragile and weak, was on the contrary strong and was enjoying growing support because of the success of China. And to understand the government system in China, you had to understand Chinese history, because there was a line of continuity from the long imperial period of China into the present period, which helped to underpin and sustain this form of governance. I mean, I can't say mine was a majoritarian point of view. It was not. But people listened to it. They had to listen to it. Why? Because of China's rise. They had to take into account another point of view, because the reality was suggesting that it just might be true. I think in America it's been more difficult. I mean, the book also sold very well in America, but the problem in America is that America is the top dog in the world. You see, Britain no longer thinks of itself really in those terms. They don't really think of they're competing with China for global leadership. They would have thought that a few decades ago, but they don't now. Whereas America feels threatened by the rise of China. And therefore, they are, by they I mean a cross-section of Chinese American opinion, including intellectuals, think that they're wary of China, they're wedded to the idea of, American exceptionalism, American leadership in the world, and so on. And the third thing, I think, was probably, I argued in the book that actually what was happening with the rise of China was that at the moment it was still primarily an economic phenomenon, and China was seen and saw itself largely in economic terms. But this was but the prelude to a situation where China developed, alongside its economic growth, political, cultural, moral, intellectual, military power and influence. In other words, we were living, probably the whole process of westernization was peaking or had already peaked, and we were going to witness the rise of China's influence, or what I call a process of Sinicization. Now, I think at the time that was not where the Chinese debate was, but now that is exactly where the Chinese debate is.